Well, I might as well introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Ambrim, Program Manager for Indigenous Engagement. I would like to acknowledge country and pay respects to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island communities. Respect to our elders, past, present, and online. Thank you. We acknowledge the first Australians, custodians of this land for thousands of years. Always was, always will be. Thank you for coming to our daily dialogues. This is the on-stage edition. It's connected to our on-stage exhibit, which closes on the 14th. We'd like to showcase our First Nations performing artists throughout history. So welcome to our Deadly Dialogues event. I'm going to introduce our people that make it deadly. Mrs. Rhianna Patrick. She's actually currently working on Hi, I'm Eddie, which is the life of Uncle Eddie himself. It's podcasting. The Black Bias, which is presented by Indigenous X Series on your favourite streaming channels. And The Briefing Thursdays and Fridays, which is connected through the Southern Cross Australia through Listeners Daily podcast. And she's been journalism and telling stories for about 20-something years now, and quite good at it. So we're very proud to have her here hosting these dialogues for the last two events and here for tonight. And our special guest, Auntie Rachael, which I might leave Rhianna to introduce. Thank you very much. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, Jeremy. I too, just as a Torres Strait Islander, wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders and any present who are also in the room. I recognise their continuing connection to the place here, as I have no bloodline to here, and I'm normally working on country which is Yagara, Jagara and Yugruple peoples of what is now called Ipswich in southeast Queensland. Rachael, do you want to acknowledge country and also where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. Just also pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri of this country that we're on, and what it must be like for them. This whole mob came along with their big white house and made it the capital of Australia. Cracks me up what they've had to having to navigate that weight. But yeah, so what an honour it is to be on this country. My mob, though I was born on Kulin country, Melbourne, or now called Nam, actually probably the other way around, first called Nam, now called Melbourne. But my family's Yidinji up just below Cairns, and Medium Mare, the Comic tribe of the most easterly island of the Torres Strait, called Mare. And my mother is Dutch, so mixed marriage. And I am a mother of one son, one boy who's now taken his first year out in the industry also as an actor. So third generation of actor, poor thing.
When I was thinking about this introduction for Rachael, there's so many things that you've done: acting, directing, working in the theatre, now artistic director for Ilbijerri Theatre Company, Indigenous Theatre Company in Melbourne. You were in a country practice, which I was so excited about, as well as many other TV series as well. And we're going to dig into that. But when I was looking at this context of theatre in this sort of, I guess, Western understanding, you know, and when we talk about theatre, we think about the ancient Greeks and that it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But when I was wanting to put this into context for tonight, you know, in Indigenous theatre telling and storytelling and theatre making and performance, it goes further back than the Greeks, like a long way back further than the Greeks. But I guess that was one of the things, is that the context that we find ourselves in now is how we utilise and have adapted to what we have around us, and this, I guess, more contemporary view of Indigenous theatre making and storytelling. And I guess it's, you know, it's also continuing this way of not only telling stories but also passing on history, and that places like Ilbijerri are doing that work in also keeping that history alive and passing that history on to the next generation. And I guess I've never known at what stage you decided to that you wanted to be on stage, that you wanted to be an actor. I mean, do you remember that moment?
I remember putting it off for as long as I could. I was like, there is no way I'm doing what my father. So I grew up in the world of theatre. So my father, amongst others, was Bob Maza, and he's no longer with us. He established the first modern blackfella theatre companies. So Nindathana in Melbourne in 1971, and then a couple of years later, we all up and moved from Melbourne to Sydney. And they had invited him because they were like, oh, well, you've already set up a company. And that Australia Council funding, they were like, they weren't going to fund the mob up in Sydney because there was no experience. So because he had that little bit of experience, they were like, Kick, you come up. So anyway, moved to Sydney and were involved in the setting of National Black Theatre Company. So that was basically the foundation of black theatre, modern black theatre in this country. Was literally, we are now celebrating 50 years of black theatre. Ilbijerri came in the next wave. So in the late 80s was the establishment of Bangarra, Yiriyarkan, Bumali Arts. Anyway, there's a whole lot of organisations that happened in that later period, including Ilbijerri Theatre. And you kind of go, well, what happens at these times? But there's usually some core, some pivotal event that happens. And so in that late 80s, it was the whole lot of playwrights conferences were happening. So there was these gatherings of fellas from all over the country converging in these spaces. And what happens when black fellas get together? And particularly, just acknowledging how important those opportunities when we all get together, that energy that happens, and that sharing ideas, sharing, and also the conversations that were happening back at that time, and going way back the time before, the dialogues that were happening internationally with other First Nations mobs was also a big part of these kind of major gear shifts that were happening.
And your dad was travelling too at that time, wasn't he, and interacting with these other Indigenous groups elsewhere around the world?
Yeah. So the world that I grew up in, going back to your question, was very much the birth of black theatre and theatre as a political tool. So there was no separation. Theatre was literally a voice by which we could, let's talk about the protests that are happening up with the Nabalco friggin' land claim that was happening up there. So the street theatre developed before National Black Theatre. And it was literally the theatre as a way of getting people on board, educating Australians, as in non-First Nation Australians, getting black fellas on board, so theatre was a way in which we got ourselves, together and talking and educated and, getting us all roused up and all that. So in my in my mind, there's never been a separation. That theatre is our voice. It is a platform by which we can speak and be political and unedited. We don't have to be filtered through any other. This is our completely self-determined spaces, and that continues to be the what sits at the heart of what I get out of bed for and the theatre that I make. So now back to your question. So I didn't want to do theatre only because it was like, and I think we all do that, hey, you want to find your thing, like what is my thing? And I felt like I didn't know what my thing was because everything had been about the theatre and the politics. But anyway, so I put it off for as long as I could, and then it was like, yeah, maybe I will do. So yeah, it wasn't until 23, so quite a bit later, where I was like, okay. I was working in a high school, a community-based high school on William Street. I don't know if everyone knows that main road down from the Coca-Cola sign there in King's Cross. There was a little community east. What was it called? Anyway, community-based high school, and it was for all black fellas. And so I was volunteering there, and then they put me on a wage or whatever, doing teaching maths and whatnot. The only subject I did good in school with. Anyway, I'm talking to one auntie there, and I was like, I'm thinking I might do acting. And she was just like, you should go check this place out. I've just been studying up in Bundjalung country up in Lismore, and they had the course up there that does dance and singing and acting. And I was like, oh, that's it. Because I was like, I don't know which area I should go. And there's a course that does it all. A little mini fame school up in Bundjalung country. So, yeah, it was that woman Auntie Christine telling me about that course. That was the point. And the other catalyst was telling my friend at high school. I was thinking, oh, yeah, I've been maybe thinking I might do acting. And she went, ha, ha, ha. She laughed in my face. I was like, so that made me all the more determined. So, yeah, it was always there. I just put it off for as long as I could because I just was determined that I'd find my own thing, but it was, then just did the full circle and came straight back. Yeah.
At what point did you recognise, I guess, the power of storytelling?
Well, I guess that goes way back. That world I grew up in. You know, like I think about that. So National Black Theatre, 1972. That's because we just moved up. We'd done like I was involved. Anyway, Jack Charles Up and Fighting was one of Nindathana's first productions with Jack Charles, and it was a series of sketch-based kind of skits. I don't remember that work at all. But a lot of those sketch-based works actually inspired basically Black,
right?
Which would be National Black Theatre's one of their first productions. So 1972, right at the end of the year there, they did that show at where the Nimrod used to be up the hill where the Griffin Theatre is now, that tiny little funny-shaped theatre. Did that play there, and their conversation was straight away, where do we need to take this theatre? Who needs this theatre the most? We want to take it to communities. And for some reason, I don't know how, they got it in their head, Yarrabah. So that was it. Got a bus. We all jumped in the bus. That I remember. So we were me and my sis, two littlies, on this crazy bus trip from Sydney all the way up to Yarrabah on the smell of an oily rag. So, yeah. And that was playing in halls, and I think they were charging something like 20 cents tickets. Like it was... because it was about making it accessible to mob all the way up, sleeping on freaking outside, and like there was none of that equity hotels and per diems and. You're lucky if you even got paid. You got food. In fact, one of the stories that Mum tells, because Mum reckon she goes, I don't know why, but she ended up being the one having to divvy out the money, and then there was none. But the trip drove everyone crazy. It was basically in that show was my dad, Bob Maza, passed away a long time ago now, Zach Martin, Aileen Corpus goes by another name now. Does anyone know? Louise Corpus or something? Anyway. And Bindi Williams. And could I say Gary Foley? Mm-mm. And there must have been 5 of them. Anyway, so this crazy trip with these peoples. Get up there, do this show, goes off, but no one makes any money, right? Not 20-cent tickets, all free if you can't afford it. Gary Foley comes up, storms up to my mum and he goes, I'm not going back in that bus, give me the money for a flight. She was just like, here's money for train fare. He had to catch a train back. Yeah, so. But there's no doubt that there was... then seeing the production of The Cake Man, which actually my sister was in, playing the little boy, and yeah, it was just...
Is it true that she beat you for that role?
Not only did she beat me, she was asked to audition that I didn't even get asked. And in fact, actually, truth be known, that's why I put off acting as long as possible. Because I definitely write, she's the one with the talent. And so I was like, proper. I was like, that's it. I didn't think I could do it.
Obviously still really fresh.
Yeah, that's still raw.
Happy I asked.
But she was so... Lisa, and there she is now on Najang there, but she's always been so confident and, extroverted and all that stuff. And I was like... Anyways.
But was it seeing the way that the Yarrabah community reacted to this play? Was that when you knew, wow, this is what a story can do, and this is the journey that a story can take
there's no
people
doubt.
on.
Yeah. And because it was comedy too, so, you know, everyone's laughing their heads off. Like, it was no doubt. And there's that thing, and even now, like when we're taking work out to communities, like that experience, because there's not, you don't have that normal polite rubbish that, you know, when people go to the theatre and it's all nice and nice. They'll tell you if they like it and they'll tell you if they hate it, you know, like real. It's real. And that's what you want. Yeah, so yeah, definitely those experiences were absolutely cemented in the heart of, that's what this is all about. And it's for those audiences, yeah.
And there's something about that, isn't there, when you go and you see a production and you see it with a predominantly non-Indigenous audience, and it's really different to when you see it with an Indigenous audience, and all those sorts of in-jokes that the Indigenous audience gets, and it's a totally different energy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, yeah. And there's actually nothing wrong with that too. Like, I'm thinking about those shows where you know where the blackfellas are sitting, and you know, and you can feel that half of the audience going, "Was that funny? Can I laugh at that too?" You know, yeah, it was just like, you could, like, literally they're laughing, ha, ha, ha. It's awesome. I think it's great. And you can feel that. And here's the crazy thing, hey, because like for years and years, like the era that I grew up in terms of starting out in acting, it was all white roles. All productions written by white fellas, white directors, that whole shebang. And you'll be playing this token black role, written like super badly, and you know, so frustrating. I lost my track. I was just talking about black and white audiences. How did I get to the tangent? Did I go on? Oh my God! Oh, far out. I was making a really good point too. Oh, damn it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it. I'll come back to it.
Just go off on it.
I'll dive back into it when I remember.
We'll follow along. In terms of those early influences of those people that told stories, most would think that it's your dad. But your dad was always off working. So who was it in the family that you grew up, I guess, learning that ability to tell a good story and the way that you tell a good story?
I mean, without a doubt, it would be the influences of being in the rehearsals, you know, seeing the black theatre productions and the touring and all that stuff. That was probably the main influence in terms of this amazing thing called theatre and the power of theatre. And then, of course, all the television and film that followed. But, I mean, Dad was often not around, and then Mum and Dad separated when I was about 15 or 14 or something. So without a doubt, I can strongly see both influences on my. I mean, I guess that applies to everyone, hey. But certainly, my mum is a huge influence on me in terms of her staunchness. Like, she was absolutely. She's a white woman, Dutch, and was adamant that however we navigated life, we were to question everything and not to conform to nothing. So, for instance, going to school, everyone's got their school uniforms. We're not allowed to have school uniforms because it was like, nah, that's for soldiers. You're not soldiers. So it was like, I just wanted a uniform. I just want to look like everyone else. Yeah. So it was just, but that was an example of just that whole, you question everything, and oh my God, I value that now. Question everything, and that whole, you know, society wants you to fit in, and the whole way schools are structured, it is all about, you know, conforming to even the way of learning, which is about not thinking and not questioning, and, you know, like, yeah, so we don't breed very healthy humans in this Western society. It's not geared towards whole, healthy beings within a healthy community. So we're kind of, yeah. Anyway, yeah, so that whole questioning everything, we were all brought up vegetarian as well, so we're the only vegetarians in every time we've gone anywhere. Yeah, so definitely I can see how both sides have been hugely. Dad in terms of the orator, the entertainer, the songman, the charmer, the entertainer extraordinaire, and then my mum's staunch. So one of my first early primary school went to a fancy dress, and all that, getting all excited about what to wear for that fancy dress. And my little friend, she's already worked out what she's wearing. She's like, I'm going as a fairy, and I'm like, oh, fairy. Like she had the little stick with the star pink and the little pink tutu thing, and she was all like pretty fairy thing. And I was like, oh, fairy. And what do I go as? Mum. She puts me in a little sandwich board with a big black fist painted up on it, saying power to the people. And I've got a little red dress underneath with all the protest badges, land rights badges on the side, and I'm holding a banner. So she's holding a friggin' little pink glittery star, and I'm holding a friggin' banner with a sandwich board. I go to my first fancy dress formal as a friggin' black activist. I'm like, that's my mum. And it was, I was the only one, let me tell you. Lots of other fairies.
At what point, I mean, you said you came to sort of making that decision about doing acting a lot later, in a way, but at what point did you go, I really should go to Whopper?
Well, that Auntie Christine now that said go to Lismore first. So I wasn't confident that it was my thing yet, and so I was like sitting on the fence line. Went and did this course in Lismore, which was the gammonest course ever. But it was what I needed. It was that got to dip my toe in the water, try it out, and built my confidence. And it was there that one of the lecturers basically said, "Oh, you probably should go and do a proper course now." So hence went to do the 3-year Whopper course. I was really keen to go as far away from anywhere else, like from the east. I was like, okay, I'm going to go somewhere where no one knows. Because my whole life it had been, oh, you're Bob Mazza's daughter. So I was feeling the shadow. Once again, I wanted to carve out my own pathway, but I'll do it over here.
On the other side of the country.
I thought on the other side of the country, but the first thing that head of acting, Jeff Gibbs, comes up and he goes, oh, Bob Mazza's daughter. I was like... Anyway, it was fine. Anyway, just jumping forward though, my first acting job was at Country Practice, now you mentioned it, and Dad was in it. So he played my uncle. So it was actually the first time I got to work with him, actor to actor. Yeah, that was pretty cool. That was pretty amazing, actually.
What do you remember of that time? What, was he sort of giving you tips as you were together on that set?
Hell no. No. I was really like cutting I was standing my ground. Like that 3 years of training. I was absolutely I was really enjoying that I could stand my ground and stand there eye to eye with my... And because Mum and Dad had separated too, like I was still a bit dirty on him, so that was actually the first time that healing happened too, working together, but working together as, peer to peer. And so that was, and then the yarns that we could then have, because we hadn't talked to him for some time. Yeah, so it was pretty amazing to build that relationship as a I felt like big shot adult. Yeah.
Yeah, well, talk me through that first big gig. Paid, obviously, I hope.
Oh, well, that first scene was having to kiss Peter Phelps.
Hello.
I know. I was like, what? Can you just program that later in the schedule? Straight up. I was there, yeah.
For the younger people in the audience, Peter Phelps.
Is this what acting is? Oh my God. Yeah.
Bit of a big deal at the time. A little bit dishy.
Yeah. It was a good kiss.
Do you have that on your LinkedIn so that you can be endorsed? I kissed Peter Phelps.
Yeah, no. No, I was really not... I was not up for doing all that kind of stuff. It's hard as an actor because you definitely need to know. You need to choose what roles and how far you're prepared to go, like, nudity or sex or all that stuff. I was like, oh, no, thank you. I'll stick with the political stuff. Yeah.
But how did you get your head around that then, of basically being, jumping into this situation that you had to do, first off?
Well, when I first started, I guess I was I was hugely naive, just like putting it right out there. I literally had stars in my eyes. I thought, I've had the full classical training like any other actor walking out that door, so I should be able to play any role like any other actor. And I very quickly realised that's not the case, because when in my time, I very quickly got put into the Aboriginal and other basket, actually, because I'd go along to auditions, so it'd be blackfellas, and the Asians and the and the everything's Africans, and it was like, oh God. So they've obviously we want someone slightly different for this role. So I was, it was still those days. There weren't many black roles, and there certainly weren't any black writers working in, say, television or directors or DOPs. Like all of that has happened in the last couple of decades. So I'm talking 3 decades ago, and there literally was nothing. So all of that early television, I can't even think of the other, there was a couple of lawyery shows. Anyway, a whole lot of, was all the same experience. I mean, God, actually it was better than how it was for Dad. Like that generation where there was literally nothing, and the only roles for black fellas were playing, gummies and, criminals. And what was Auntie Justine Saunders? She said to me one day, because we were on a show together, and she was like, talking about her experience and how frustrated, because, she's mega famous and was the first black woman ever on number 96 and all sorts of stuff. Yeah. I was like, and, I totally looked up to her and all that. I was like, and she said, I got to that point where I was sick of playing roles where I got raped and didn't have any lines. I was just like, okay, I'll stop complaining now. I was like, oh my gosh. At least I had a few lines and I could keep my clothes on. But really, really, really frustrating, because the roles were always badly written, stereotypical, two-dimensional, small. It was really... And in fact, it was because of all that I ended up going, I'm sick of acting, and made the decision to move to directing. Just that whole... frustration. Don't get me wrong, there was definitely a couple of good roles. Even in that country practice, I was playing a lawyer. So it was, there was definitely... And obviously I'm generalising, because Dad was cast as the lawyer in Belle Bird back in 1967, something like that, 68. So he was playing, and that was radical as. Here's this smooth, suave, in a suit, black lawyer turns up to some country town. So that was really quite progressive. But hilariously, they got heaps of complaint mail. Not because they'd never seen a black man being a lawyer before, but because the black man had a white girlfriend. So that's what people complained about. That would never happen. That's how highly offensive. Which was like, we actually based that on his story. My Dutch mum. Anyway.
Well, I was thinking about, because you were talking about how, for your dad's generation, it was very much really about trying to break the door down to be even able to walk through it.
Yeah.
But at the time, you get things like Basically Black on the ABC, which then takes another 40 years until you see another Aboriginal comedy show on an Australian television network. And you watch it with the perspective of today, and you think, I can only imagine what it was like watching that at the time. But that's, it's still cutting edge. It's still highly relevant, and you're just not sure if you should be laughing when you're laughing.
Wrong, it's pretty wrong too. There's some stuff in there you're like, you couldn't get away with that. Like Gary Foley playing a Japanese warrior. Jesus Christ. Oh no, Bindi Williams plays that role. I am samurai warrior. I'm like, but absolutely in your face, political. Mind you, you talk to anyone who knows Gary Foley, he'll talk about how that was the washed out version.
Yeah, because there was a lot of non-Indigenous people working on that program, right?
That's right. And the whole idea was that it was going to be a series. So that was just going to be the first of many. But Anyway, so they ended up watering it right down, just putting in the lighter stuff, the not so political in-your-face stuff, and only did the one series. So that whole process was compromised. But it was definitely. One of the things that we are at a very particular turning point, which we've been in for quite a while, but doesn't matter, where, like I just said, theatre only just started 51 years ago. And basically Black, Nimrod Theatre, basically Ken Haller directed it, white barrister lad. John Bell was the head of Nimrod at that time, and they basically created this space for blackfellas to get on stage. So the role that certain whitefellas in the community played in really kind of being an ally, making and creating spaces and opportunities for blackfellas. The problem is they kind of, that metaphor, they opened that door, but then they never let go of the handle.
Or the keys.
Or the key, yeah. Or they've still got their, and we're still having to now navigate the same space where actually it's like there's still a lot of these, I'd like to say old guard, but it's still very prevalent, where we haven't, as a nation, made the distinction of what does truly self-determination look like in practice. So yes, we understand, we're starting to kind of have that dialogue in regards to recognition and the voice to Parliament and all this, and treaty even, and the truth-telling that's happening down in Victoria. So, and yet, and certainly going back to the arts bubble, we don't seem to understand it at all. We're still fighting for this space of that might look like an Indigenous work or Aboriginal work, but it's not. There's white writers on it and there's white directors on it. And we're not, that distinction is so important. It has everything to do with the cultural and creative integrity and authenticity of that work. So who is in control of the crafting of the work is going to imbue that with their inbuilt biases. I mean, it's just how we roll, as we all have our inbuilt biases. So we have 200 years of our stories and our narratives being created by the coloniser. That there's a very unhealthy dynamic in that. As a First Nations person, there is we are at a time where it absolutely cannot continue. We're demanding that space. For us to go forward as a nation, self-determination at its core has to be embedded and built up from the ground up in how we move forward. Black people have to be self-determined in their own affairs. It's a really simple concept and it's not rocket science. Everybody wants that. Everybody wants authority over their lives. So in terms of this situation with First Nations fellas in Australia, Indigenous people of this country, so we've had 200 years of other people telling our narratives. Needless to say, there's a lot of false narratives out there. And so there's a whole lot of backtracking that needs to happen. And that's why it's so important now, more than ever, that we go that step forward and all those fellas let go of the door handle and get out. Open, the door's open. We're already open now. We're in the room. So you can let go and step away. And it's, like I said, it's a distinction that we're not making. There is still this blurry line. Anyway, I totally went off your questions.
No. Well, it's perfectly fine because I do want to dig into this a little bit later, but I think it leads on from my next question of just talking about your career. And I guess, I remember when Radiance came out.
That's where I started, yeah.
Yeah, I remember very much people talking about you because you'd been in Cosy the year before and the film version of that. And then Radiance came out. And I remember feeling, as a younger person, I'm not going to give a lot away, I remember feeling really excited by that, of seeing this film that was directed by an Indigenous woman, that had 3 Indigenous female characters in there, and thinking, whew, it's going to change. It's all going to change. But we'll come back to that. But, but I guess, what was it like working on Radiance, which really is, it's a part of history now?
And it's also actually typical of this tension that literally what we're talking about. It was a white writer, Louis Nowra, who wrote the stage play, who had come out of a relationship with Annie Justine. So he's an expert on all things black. He was being commissioned. He had been commissioned by Rhoda and Lydia. And the story goes that work was developed in absolute hand-holding, a long process of development with Lydia and Rhoda guiding Louis on writing those characters. They would feed back, it would get written, and it was this integrated role. And something, this is only a conversation I was having recently, and just really being really aware of that distinction, that in their mind, they commissioned him to write their story, the story that they wanted to write. And yet, as we know, history acknowledges and credits that whoever gets their name on the poster. So Louis Nowra walks away with all this credit as the writer of this piece, which absolutely they were an integral part of. So it's that real... Anyway, that's a whole nother tangent I can go off on, but it's like, how do we honour the story holders when our Western system is completely biased towards the Western written word versus the oral word. So the stories that were spoken and shared from Lydia and Rhoda, that gets no credit. All credit gets put to the person who said, oh, what was that you said? Oh, how would you say it? Yeah. He gets the credit. So the pen is mightier than the word. And who does that bias? Who gets left out of that course? Oral history. Oral people whose history and knowledge is passed down orally. So there's already a kind of... anyway, I wasn't going to go down that path, and there you went.
But it is always about the credit, isn't it? It's always about whose name is there. And sometimes those two worlds don't necessarily match up in terms of oral history and I guess the acknowledgement of how oral history works and the credit given there versus whose name is actually on it and who wrote it down.
Exactly. So, but what that does, I guess, make the point too, is that that work was very much informed by their voices. So yes, on paper it's written by a white fella, but actually I think why that work has been so successful and was so good was because of their role within that. So they commissioned the first work. They were in the first stage play, which I was in with Lydia and Rhoda at Belvoir Street Theatre.
So Rhoda Roberts and Auntie Lydia Miller. Yep.
Yeah, and myself were in the I can't remember what year now, 96? No, that was the film. Must have been a couple of years before that. Oh, shut up, it was my first year out of acting school, so 93. A stage play with those two awesome women. I was like absolutely blown out in awe. I just couldn't believe how amazing that experience was to work with those two. And then a few years later, the film would happen, and I was lucky to be cast in that, but playing a different character than I'd played on the stage production. But yeah, it was absolutely iconic, and once again, putting it in historical context, and you don't appreciate it when it's at the time, but if I reflect on the frustration of the playing all these shitty-ass, badly written roles for the last decade. Oh, I exaggerate, for 3 years. Anyway, since for years I've been playing. Anyway, Radiance came along and it was like, here's a big, juicy role. It's black. It's, powerful story. It was incredibly, once again, I didn't appreciate actually the significance, the historical significance of it, because that work was technically the third black film directed by a black person production. The first, in fact, sorry, I've now forgotten which order they went in, but Brian Soren's Gingerly Lady, and which I never saw, and Tracy Moffat's Bedevil. Which was the 3-part phenomenal. We were only just speaking earlier.
You can't even put it in.
It's still cutting edge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how to describe that film. You just have to see it. NITV, SBS On Demand, it's there.
Yeah.
Just quietly.
Extraordinary. So here was Radiance, this extraordinary, kick-ass film, which got 2 weeks in the cinema, and only a few cinemas around the country. But yet it's gone on to live on well on beyond that because of, it plays at least once a year on TV every year. It comes on NAIDOC Week and whatnot, and you can stream it and all that stuff. So it was just like the film then has reached a much wider audience since. And it really, at the time, felt like, right, it's happening, here we go. Australia, nothing. Still waiting for my second film. Anyway. But Deb did well, that was the main thing. To see where the industry has come since then is just mind-bogglingly. Just blows my mind what's on TV all the time now. Watching Wayne Blair's incredible direction there in Total Recall. But there's all the shows that are on the Misty Road on Saturday nights, and it's just, anyway, the calibre of work that's being created and the number of black directors that are in those studios and in those film sets and DOPs and everything now, like it's a new world. It is, but it didn't happen by itself. It was my dad's generation, Wal Saunders, Lester Bostock, a whole lot of people who established the film unit at AFTRS, years of fighting and negotiating and lobbying to get an Indigenous-focused training stream within AFTRS, the National Australian Film and Television Radio Schools. The Indigenous unit at Australian Film Commission was established. The Australian Film Commission started the short film initiatives. So suddenly, and they were like very well funded, very well mentored and supported. So there was this, here we go, there's your little stepping stones, douche, douche, douche. Then they had the 20-minute series. At the same time, there was the Indigenous unit at ABC kicking off, and at SBS. So there was this from training straight through work opportunities. This incredible feed line that happened, and every one of these amazing filmmakers and TV directors and stuff that we've got out there, we're all a part of that, all a part of that program. It doesn't happen by itself. It takes lobbying, all those fellas that lobbied for that, and then all the investment and planning that needs to go into those things to ensure that they stay. That you can't have those one-offs. This is a long-term thing, and it pays off. And we're seeing it now. Every time you flick on that TV.
Oh, we've just had the first Indigenous vampire series, Firebite, from Warwick Thornton.
Yeah.
We've had the first Indigenous sci-fi film, I guess, if Ivan Sends Loveland is, that was many years in development. We're going into these spaces that we haven't been seen before. But I guess if we go back to theatre now, you sort of just mentioned that you'd stepped away from acting because those roles weren't there when you wanted them to be there. And after Radiance, they weren't really there. And you went on to do a bit more TV, but then you were also very much starting to be in this theatre world as well and find this love of directing, where you very clearly before said that you liked bossing other people around. I think that was basically it. So I wonder, you know, where are we with Indigenous theatre in this country, and who are those spaces like Ilbijerri that are doing this work?
Yeah. So theatre has struggled and continues to be where film was 20 years ago. Like, we actually still exist in at least there's a little bit of crossover with actors, but pretty much the worlds are separate worlds. They're very different skills in terms of directing and DOPs and stuff. You're not, a film director is never a theatre director or vice versa. You know, unless they've kind of literally got trained in both areas or whatever. So theatre is really struggling. There was a time where there was about 5 or 6 theatre companies. There are now 3. And that's Ilbijerri in Melbourne, Yiriyarkan in Perth, and then more recently, now about 13 years old, is Moogal in Sydney. There was Ilbijerri in Brisbane, gone. And there have been other ones that have come and gone over the years. In Sydney, there was Ant. I can't list them all. Obviously, there was Jack Davis's company back in the day. Anyway, there's been companies that have come and gone. But yeah, it's very bleak, actually. I've been at Ilbijerri for 14 years, and even we're celebrating our 30th last year, actually. But when I started, it was only stepping out of being an actor and an independent artist that in a company, it was like the first time I actually got to step and look out and see what was going on around me. It was like, oh my God, I didn't realise it was so bad. There is only one set designer, blackfly set designer in this country, working in theatre, and that's Jacob Nash, and he's done all those projects with Bangara and has started branching out, working with other theatres, but that's it. That's it. There's one lighting, or maybe 2 now, Mark Howard and Chloe Ogilvie are the only people working in lighting. You know, so anyway, it's actually really tough. It's really hard. And what's hard about that is there's the ecology. So it's not like there's a pool of artists that you can choose from. So, and often, because of that only one Jacob, it's like often you're still working with a whole lot of white fellas, creatives, you know, and God bless them, they're fantastic. But in terms of being self-determined, there's that constant, and we all know it, hey, when you're working with these other cultures, there's always an element of education. Like, you're always having to explain yourself or, you know, educate the others. And obviously some are, you know, better than others and all that sort of stuff, but it's exhausting. It takes, it takes energy, it takes resources, and the thing that I keep, that sits at the heart of why hasn't things improved? Like, why are there still white directors thinking it's still okay to work in our space, and what, you know, and it's because we as a country haven't made the distinction. And we don't understand why that distinction is so important, and at its heart, anyway, is that. Sorry, I feel like I'm always like, oh, everybody already knows this, but we mustn't know it, and maybe my theory's not right, or anyway. But you know, we all come with an inherent, you know, society has its kind of belief systems, and the main dominant narratives and belief systems, the collective subconscious of Australia has a viewpoint on who black people are and what happened in the history of this country. And there's a whole stream of inbuilt biases that people don't realise that they have. So that becomes, and as I said earlier too, that's a really big problem when you're telling someone else's story, if you're not aware of your biases and your prejudices, all the best intentions in the world. And an example of that is what are the types of stories we tell? So as a human nature, I think, is that we're defined by our stories. Yeah, we're defined by the stories of our history. So we will tell the stories of, like, it's fascinating to watch how masterful storytellers are, to be able to turn Gallipoli into a hero story when actually we were a biggest bunch of losers. Like, it's extraordinary, the artfulness and the skill of how we can shift a narrative, because fundamentally we are informed by the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories of those that have gone before us, our heroes. So we build our identity on the stories that have been created. And there's this incredibly, I was sitting on a toilet in Richmond, and there was someone had stuck out this quote and stuck it on the back of the toilet. I was doing a development or whatever. Anyway, and I'm like, what the? Anyway, this black American woman called Grace Lee Boggs, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I should bloody memorise it. You think I could memorise it being an actor? But anyway, history is not what happened in the past. It's the stories we tell about the past. Mm-hmm. And how we tell those stories has everything to do with how we move forward. So that we as storytellers are in the process of making history, the history that defines who we are and how we move forward. Like, blew my mind. I was just suddenly in that moment on that toilet. It was just like, that's exactly what we do. That's what we are in terms of story makers and narrative makers. We are all defined by story. Every day, we are all story makers. When we're yarning, we're retelling a story. It's slightly different from the way you told it last time. You're in the action. You're in the activity of making story and evolving it and adapting it. And yeah, so
how do you push forward then? How do you push forward through that?
Well, this
default?
is why, once we understand the importance of this concept called self-determination, the importance of those whose story it is have the authority and the creative control over the telling of that story, when we all understand why that's important, because someone else cannot tell your story. And we have a 200-year history of being negatively stereotyped and victimised and blah blah blah, and all these kind of unspoken subconscious narratives of how we're all the dying race and there aren't really any black fellas left, and lower IQ and whatever these really negative bullshit myths are. We have a job as black fellas of redressing those narratives. So I am in the business of rewriting the narrative, of rewriting the history. And right, I mean by R-I-G-H-T, like making it right, because it's wrong. What people understand of us is wrong. And hence, when we all know it, every time it comes up, this whole we're still arguing over what should be taught in schools and the sort of language we should be using. And oh my God, I was walking up that Mount Ainslie on Sunday, anyway, whatever day, just the other day, and there's that really weathered plaque that tells the story of it's the only one that told the Aboriginal story, that, this was the lands of the Ngunnawal, and you had to read like that because it's so faded out. And it talks about, goddammit, how when the settlers came, it disrupted the life of the Ngunnawal, and society became fragmented. They brought their sheep and their disease. Sorry, the colonisers. There was no mention of it. Was the language of they're still using that kind of language, and this is the capital of Australia is still doing that to the Aboriginal people of this land. It was a really kind of moment. I was ready to rip that thing off. What? I just expected it to be a bit more on top of it. Anyway, it was just that dreadful reminder of how much work still we have to do, and how deeply, deeply problematic that is. And and just to be a little bit more optimistic, we're hearing something happen right now. There is something happening right now in this country with the whole change of government and this putting it right on the front of the table. The first thing he said was, giving a voice to Parliament and whatnot. Like there's definitely some positive shit happening at the moment. I guess let's just see how it all goes. But yeah, So how we move forward is that we as a country step up to the plate and acknowledge the importance of the first peoples of this country being self-determined in their affairs. It's that simple.
But is it also understanding what that means?
Oh, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly it. It was like we don't understand that distinction yet.
And I think, is it more than just understanding and listening? We hear this thing of,
that's what I keep
you
saying.
need to listen.
It's got to be about knowing your own bias, like knowing your whiteness and your privilege. And that means, it's complex, because we're talking about like going and seeing a psychotherapist, and looking at you, analysing yourself. Like, everyone's got to do the homework. Like, It's complex.
Yeah.
Because obviously you can say it till the cows come home, but it's like, the penny's not dropping. Like, you saw that when you walked up Mount Ainslie. Yeah.
So on that, if it's about who should be telling those stories when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories, is there also a feeling around, I guess, like what that way forward is? In 2022, should you still be doing that? Telling stories that are not your own?
Oh, hell no. No, this is exactly what I'm saying. We need to get to the stage where, it's even So within the arts, the history of kind of Western arts is built on this kind of idea that the artist is a conduit. And I just, I stood there and I read about that person's story, or I sat and ate their food, or I'm being stupid, but anyway, I just absorbed them, and then I now can tell their story because they're in me, and I'm just a neutral vessel. So that Western arts is built on this idea that artists are just vessels, and there's absolutely no, and even that comes from a white privilege. Like, you can only say that because you have no idea that that you're not the centre of the universe. Like, there are complete other worlds of belief systems and value systems that actually sideline yours. So that when I'm now going to kind of digress about where this gets really complex too, is it. And what you're kind of sort of leading to, what I'm reading into it, is that this applies to blackfellas too. Mm. So I am not an authority to tell a Ngunnawal story. It's not my story to tell. The absolute same rules apply to me as Joe Blow next door. And this is this is really exciting. It's actually exciting that we're getting to this stage, because it wasn't that long ago. It was like all blackfellas were blackfellas fighting the same cause. We've got the same enemy and we're all on the same bandwagon. And it's easy to reflect back and romanticise about, wasn't that wonderful that all that time that we all were one. But what we need to, but in the same breath, we're acknowledging and celebrating that actually we've now moved to this next stage, which is really kind of embedding what does that actually mean to be a blackfella. And it has everything to do with who you are in relation to your land and your culture, obviously, which is the thing that binds your land, you and your people. So your place in a major network, and is basically what being a blackfella is. So what can, with the disruption of colonisation and the impact that it's had on blackfellas, stolen generation and blah 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 blah, there's a whole spectrum of blackfellas in terms of their experience and knowledge of who they are and where their land is and their culture and their language, and if you were to put that on a spectrum, the fellas that down one end who grew up on country, know their language, know their totems and their culture and their networks, and they know exactly how they fit in with their family thing. And down the other end, you've got someone who knows nothing. They've only just been told. And they're right at the beginning of their journey. And there's the rest of us that are just everywhere in between. And with that disruption it has meant that people don't understand the protocols. And it's just really simple. It's just like not understanding the laws, the rules of the house kind of thing. You know, you don't know that you're not allowed to, stand on the kitchen table or whatever your rules are. But similarly, if you don't know what those protocols mean, and basically in its simplest form, being a blackfella and knowing the protocols basically means that you know that you don't have the authority to do dick shit about anything, even your own mob. Like, there is a whole protocol which means because every family has their head of the family, and there's so many families within a mob. So there's a whole network of protocol that has to be gone through when telling story. And it takes time. But yeah, going back to who has the right to tell someone else's story, even telling your own story has a whole lot of protocol. And this is a problem. This can be a problem. You'll have someone from their mob who goes off and they want to go off and tell their story, but they haven't consulted with any of their own family, because they're like, nah, I'm going to do what I want. And it's a problem. And you'll find they'll have problems, and there's going to be a whole lot of backlash. So it's the protocol, the understanding, the concept is actually really simple, but then how it actually plays out, it's not complicated. It just takes a long time, and it's that you bring basically every time you move forward, you bring your mob with you. So that concept's actually really simple in practice, but it's not how this society, the society outside cultural protocol works. And it always used to crack me up too when I was looking over at white fellas who can go off and just do any old play. I was like, wouldn't that be easy? Just go and do whatever you want. Don't have to ask anyone. Tell any old story you want. God, that looks easy. But I was like, I don't want to do that. So yeah, it definitely takes longer, but anyway, it really is the only way. It's the only way you do it, and it's the only way you're going to get it right, if that's what you want to do.
I'm going to open the floor very soon to questions. So if you have a question, get it ready. I guess, Rachel, I wanted to end on, really what does the future look like for Indigenous theatre? Like, what do you think what is the vision that you have for it going forward?
I find that question actually catches me off guard, because it's like, I don't really think about that, because in this industry you're so like you're just doing the do. You're just in the middle of it, in the thick of it. But I do need to start thinking about it, because I've just been included on the Minister Tony Burke's First Nations Little Advisory Group in the lead up to this cultural policy, arts and cultural policy that the government's putting back on the table, because that the last government pulled off the table. Like, the fact that we have a federal government that doesn't have an arts and cultural policy for decades now is just like absolutely shocking. So it's really critical that First Nations are centred in this cultural and arts policy. So it's really quite a privilege to be a part of this, but no pressure, I'm stressed out as. So yes, I have been thinking about what that means, and it's really embedding these core values of being self-determined as First Peoples storytellers. There's the example that I gave about the film industry. I want to see a similar investment for the theatre sector. There's a whole. There were various training schools around. There's still a couple that are going. The 1 year over in at WAPA and ACPA is still going. But even then, theatre is actually a really small component of that course. So there really is, Eora's gone, Tranby's gone, and there weren't really many anyway. So there's a real lack of training ground for our mob. and you know, how we address this massive gap in all the other creative fields. I mean, there's such specialist fields, set design and lighting design and sound design. But anyway, I'm really keen to see some just really genuine, strategic, long-term investment in the sector. And I feel like obviously, as you can see, I'm still liking how, because it's such big, overarching kind of work. It's like, how do you capture that in a kind of neat and punchy way that politicians can digest? It's like, oh, I'm really not politics. Anyway, but I think one of the first things is really understanding those distinctions and why those distinctions are important, because it's when people, while white companies and white directors and, you know, all the best intentions in the world still think that they're the best person positioned to tell our stories, then we've still got a problem. So there's a whole lot of work that needs to happen in that, them understanding how important it is to create culturally safe spaces for our mobs. So whether that's we take over those spaces, there's a whole lot of work that needs to happen around the touring of work and how the work and the artists are held when they visit other countries, how they're held by the mobs. And most of these venues don't even have a relationship with their TOs. So there's a whole body of work that needs to happen, you know, all over the country. But then really, it's like, where are the black presenters? You know, where are those spaces that are, you know, where are the cultural hubs by which our work can be hosted and held around the country? At the moment, we're entirely reliant on white performing arts spaces. We have very, very, I can't think of anything. I mean, maybe you could sort of say Rhoda when she was at the Opera House, but even then that's a big white monolith. Kayaf sort of doesn't really do theatre. There's a little bit of theatre that's going on there. Anyway, as you get my point. Oh, Yurrumboi Festival, that's kicking up again. Well, not that it went away, but it's resettled. Down in Melbourne, that's an all First Nations festival. So really hoping that one goes well. But yeah, it's how do we make the distinctions that create space, but there also needs to be some long-term strategic investment in the sector. But going back to that point about where we are as a country and this really, really exciting shift, you know, I talk about those waves. I reckon we're having another one of those waves where there's a real want to move forward as a country, you know, and how this country, obviously there's a whole lot of shame and guilt and all that stuff warranted, but you know, for us to get to the stage where we celebrate who we are as a country and we celebrate the extraordinary, long, rich, unbelievably diverse cultures across this country. And imagine if every school taught the local language of those mobs and everybody who grew up in that little country town or whatever was learning the language of the local mobs. And those little kids from those local mobs walked down the street feeling like Kingpin. It's like, because this is my country, and that was embraced and celebrated. I mean, that's the country that we all want to see, isn't it? Isn't it? And so it feels like we're taking a bit of a small adult step right at this moment in time. So, you know, that bigger picture stuff informs the little pictures.
Might open up to a couple of questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. We do have a microphone getting around.
2 microphones.
Oh, down the front. Microphone is coming. One moment, please.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rhiannon. And Rachel, you touched across quite the trajectory. Wonderful to hear Justine's name being mentioned. I remember meeting her in Hobart I think 2005 when she was doing, was it The Last Taxi out of Sydney? That was her last theatre play before she got sick.
Yeah.
And I was an undergrad at
Or out of Darwin.
UTS.
Yeah.
Out of Darwin. So she was doing it in Hobart.
Yeah.
And I was an undergrad at UTS. So I'll get to the Black Theatre Company. You're talking about Redfern?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was sitting with my supervisor in a hotel in Hobart, and I saw this woman with the most ravishing drop of pearl hair. And I said to my supervisor, a Murray from Queensland, Sonia Link, I said, who is that? And she said, wait till she turns around. She said, she's Aboriginal, I can tell. And she turned around, it was Justine. And I said, oh my gosh, it's Justine Saunders. She said, go and introduce yourself. I said, I'm not part of that film sector, I'm part of the literature. And she said, go and introduce. And she was just the most endearing woman. And when you touched on the scenes that they propelled her into, which, yeah. So, and that began, I think, for her, was it not The Women of the Sun in the 1980s through ABC? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that totally, she told me, totally traumatised her. Totally traumatised her. Now, I've always wanted to know, Rachel, why were you in Fringe Dwellers? Or was that not?
I feel like we were too young. Because that was
Right.
that was, yeah.
Yeah,
that was-
and we had Ilbijerri as the old lady
I certainly
at the
wasn't
window.
acting then anyway. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, the star started casting that film. It's
oh,
like-
totally,
And everyone's so young. But
Totally.
Yeah, Ilbijerri and
yeah. So, I'm a great admirer of your father's work as well. So, since there weren't a whole lot of hands jumping up, I'm going to hit you with some names, and I just want one word. It can be an adverb, adjective, noun, whatever. Okay, let's go. Let's go. Jimmy Chai.
yeah.
One
Legend.
word.
Legend, yeah.
Jack
And
Charles.
Bless him. Oh, man, seriously awesome, amazing. Hey, shut up, 3 words. Yeah, no, he's very dear to me because I've worked very closely with him. And in fact, one of them early plays I seen was him playing Bonaparte or something. Anyway,
right.
he come out, he had these 2 white fellas dressed in that frontier soldiers, soldier uniforms, and he was full starkers.
Wow. Commando.
On the Opera House stage.
Wow.
I was like, okay.
Wonderful. Trisha Morton-Thomas.
Yes. My God. Obviously, we were in Radiance together. Yeah. No, she's stunningly talented. And the first thing she said when we met, she goes, you know, when I decided I wanted to be an actor, because I saw you and I knew I could do better.
And she recently done Triple M?
Triple M.
Yeah,
Triple
does
M.
it? That was quite funny.
Oh, yeah, she's hilarious.
Ernie Dingo.
Yeah. He and Dad were very close, and it was him and Dad that went to ABC with this idea for a television show,
Which was?
Heartlands.
Yes.
And they came in with the scripts, and the ABC producers went, that's a good idea, but that main central role should be a white woman.
And
So that main central role was meant to be a black woman, not a Kate Blanchett, just saying.
yes, and so Ms. Blanchett got it. And she also, you spoke about your father in Bellbird as the lawyer with a white woman, and so Kate also received postal bag loads of hate mail for having kissed Ernie multiple times. And that was only like in the late 90s, wasn't it? Heartlands?
Yes, yeah, because I finished acting school. Yeah.
And
that was
Deborah
Aaron
Mail-
Pedersen's first acting role.
Right, and Deborah Mailman? One word?
She is the most gorgeous, beautiful, warm thing, and exactly how she is on that screen is how she is in real person. So, I mean, you probably all know her. Like, she's just so warm and generous and, yeah, amazing.
That's
amazing woman.
great.
And incredibly talented. Her performance in that second series, because I didn't watch the first series, of Total Control, like, she should be smashing out Oscar, I don't know what awards we give over here. What awards? Anyway, whatever award, she should
All
be
the
getting
awards,
it.
all the
the awards. Yeah, that was the most phenomenal. But obviously Wayne Belair's directing too. I was like, he should be getting awards for that direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was stunning.
Thank you. Great admirer of your family's work and your contribution, obviously, to Australian theatre. And thanks for taking us through the Black Theatre Company. You would be familiar with Bamali, Barney Jennifer, and Jeffrey Samuels and Tracy Moffat when they all just pushed through Glebe and Redfern.
Yeah. Another amazing artist is that Leah Purcell, because
Yes.
that's actually where I
Yes.
seen her performing at Bamali. She was getting up and she
really?
got up and sang. She'd just come down to Sydney for the first time, young
Wow,
thing,
yeah.
and she was singing that song of hers, Run Daisy Run.
Wow.
And like, it was like, who is this woman? And then
Yep.
now look at her.
Yep.
With the Drovers thing there.
Yes.
And film, book, TV show like What Next.
Yes.
Amazing. She is such an inspiration.
Yeah.
And how is it she's looking even better looking and more younger every time? Like,
Yeah, I know. I stroked my chin and thought, must be that Waka Waka from Cherbourg on her mother's side, perhaps. I don't know. But you're also an inspiration, so I'd just like to say thank you very much, and thank you, Rhianna. Thank you.
thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, down the front here. Hang on. Just COVID safe. There you go, Auntie.
I'm just going to make some comments about, thank you for that. It was fabulous and you just covered everything. One thing, Gingerly Lady is on a video somewhere. God knows where, but it is, because I've seen it. And I used to teach at University of Canberra, and I used to show my students that.
Oh my God, I want to see it.
So, and I know it's there, and they had it in the library, so I was able to draw it out and show students. So it's around.
Yeah. Well, and
National Film and Sound Archives must have a copy. They have to.
Because I seen a doco, because it was on I can't remember the name of it, but it was actually about the second 1987, or no, the first maybe, 1987 Black Playwrights Conference.
Yep.
And they had everybody was so young. Lydia and Rhoda were kids, practically. I mean, they were young adults. But everyone, Jack Davis, Dad, Ernie Dingo, Udjuru, anyway, stunning documentary on that Playwrights Conference. But the extraordinary freaking talent in our mobs.
Yep.
Yeah.
And, in terms of, these white fella gatekeepers who are still, really gatekeeping our work in literature and writing, one of the big issues has been how do we retrain editors from mainstream publishing houses to understand, because, all of us who are writers as well have had issues with mainstream publishers who want to change phrasing, who want to change titles because they don't get it. And, we've actually run in the past through Aboriginal Studies Press, we've even run training for mainstream editors to help them understand blackfella way of thinking and talking. And we've won a few, but we've got a long way to go. And it always, from my teaching experience, one of the things I used to say to my white students was, so how does it feel to be colonised? And they'd say, what do you mean? We haven't been colonised. And I'd say, are you sure you haven't been mentally colonised? What are you carrying around in your head that you absorbed without critical thinking, with your cornflakes at breakfast and in school and whatever?
This is exactly
that shapes this. And so one of the things I used to make my students do was attempt to decolonise their heads before they started on the content of what we were teaching. And so my thinking is maybe we need to just say, okay, the common ground is we've all been colonised. We know it. You fellas don't know it yet. So we're going to help you understand how to decolonise yourselves, because you've been hard done by the past as well. So invite them to come to a decolonisation party in our training sessions. So, you know, it does work. It upsets people, but eventually it works.
Yeah, I'd love to keep talking about this, like about what is that, how to bring that awareness. Like I've sat in on great talks where Genevieve Greaves, for instance, talks about whiteness and privilege and how that's actually where the conversation starts. And anyway, now I can't remember how she did it because it was like so profound. But yeah, it's that what are these conversations and distinctions that we need to be making that actually where the penny drops. Maybe I need to do a play about it.
Maybe.
Well, that was going to be my next suggestion, you know. That's a great subject for a play. It's great. It's fantastic.
Just making notes who said what.
Yeah. And taking credit.
Yeah, credit.
But
Yeah.
just thank you, and I'll pass
Thank
the
you,
mic
Annie.
on if anyone else has questions or comments.
Any questions?
Oh, I think there's... Oh, okay. I feel like I'm going to make Jeremy run up the back to you, and then I'll come to you here down the front. Rebecca, 1 second, please, Rebecca. We're just
And we'll make
making
Rebecca
Jeremy
the
run
last
up the back.
So when you're directing a play, do you tend to collaborate with a playwright from your country, or do you like... Sorry, what's like your creative process when you're directing a play? Like, is it a very collaborative event, or do you take...
I guess the way I work is actually particular to the way in which the work is made. So this wasn't intentional, but basically almost everything I've worked on, I've also been a part of the development of that work from its seed, from its idea. So, and I kind of, in hindsight, when I look back, I'll go, oh, actually what's amazing about that is I get to be a part of that process and to embed that process is done right way. So, yes, I'm always, hence the writer is a big part of that process. There's definitely a point where that relationship drops off, like halfway through the rehearsal process when you're ready to go on, the writer's job is done. Though there is a whole nother conversation around we're having at the moment with the Australian Writers Guild, because the Western art, this Western art form thing called theatre that privileges the writer over the speaker, is all embedded in law in this place called the Australian Writers Guild, the AWG, and we literally started this conversation literally 1 week ago about that what are they doing that acknowledges. So, for instance, a writer it gets a commission, and then they'll get the 10% royalty. So once you've had your premiere season, beyond that, all that money that comes through the box office, 10% goes to the writer. So when you've got a writer working with, say, an elder to tell this story about whatever, that's either that elder's story or that community or that family story, that writer traditionally, as in white traditionally, gets the 10% royalty, and this lad here gets nothing. So we're like, what are you going to do about that? Like, what needs to happen to honour that contribution? I would argue should deserve a bigger proportion than this one, but I don't want to take away from the skills of the person who knows how to craft and edit. And like, that's a skill. Writing is a skill. Okay, I don't want to take away from that. But at the moment, they're all given acknowledgement, and these fellas are not. So actually, we're in this process of working with these lawmakers around how do we redress that so that there is acknowledgement both in the fee and the crediting and the royalty for the orator, for the one who speaks the story compared to the one who sits there and writes it. And then there's all the other layers that we talked about earlier around all the protocols. So that, say for instance, we're working now with this one elder in Papunya, and he's me. I'm learning too. because, you know, I was Western trained, theatre trained, so I'm still learning and we're getting better and better at it as a company. But I was like, it's his story. So he's the elder, like he is the elder of his mob there. And we're telling his story. So I'm like, well, he doesn't have to, because I'm thinking hierarchy. He doesn't have to tell anyone. No good. That's where I was like, oh, of course, dirt. He's like, oh yeah, no, I've just got to go and let the mother 5 families. I've got to go and sit down and speak with all of them, and then I can give you an answer. And I was just like, what? Oh, of course. Yeah, it just was like, oh my gosh. And the difference is, I don't have to tell him the protocol because he knows the protocol, and he's teaching me, obviously. Whereas, as the producing company, we can't assume people know the protocol. So sometimes I might be working with a younger writer, and it's their story or whatever, but it's like, I've got to still make sure that you make sure who you've spoken to. Yeah. And it's because a lot of our mob have been working in the sector for a long time, so they've got bad habits, and they, we got it. We don't always get it right either.
Rebecca, I think. Question? Yeah. No, that's all right. Just.
I wanted to go back to what you were. First of all, thank you for the whole discussion tonight, but thank you for bringing, I guess, to this space that discussion around who's telling whose stories, and why are white fellas in 2022 still telling black fellas stories, you know? And I say this because our little team here at the National Library and Indigenous Engagement, Jeremy, me and the rest of the team, there's not a day that goes by where we don't have a request from some white fellow who wants to use something in the collection here to tell a black fella story. Or even sometimes, like you say, it's another black fellow who wants to tell a story that isn't theirs to tell, you know. And so there's not a day that doesn't go by that we're not doing some kind of education and telling people why that's not bloody okay, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And I guess my question, if to turn this into a question, like I said, thank you for bringing that conversation to right here and now, because I think it's really, really important. I guess my question is about how you maintain and how you've maintained your resilience in that constant barrage of, you know, having to constantly push against that tide of, you know, the wrong people wanting to tell stories that aren't theirs to tell, the white fella still clutching to those doors, you know. I
mean, I have to say, working in a black organisation, I'm coming from a safe place. So I don't have to be having. That's not entirely true. We've got there's some white stuff in the company, so there is every now and then there's. Okay, let's just slow down and stop. So there's definitely. It's definitely ongoing, but I have to say, at my heart, I don't know if it's because I'm a Sag or I'm my dad's daughter or something, but I am eternally optimistic.
Yep.
I do have a lot of hope.
That's
I have a huge amount of hope for this country.
Yeah, I think that's
and I do. And here's another thing that I learned a long time ago too is this was actually a lesson I learned off Pat O'Shane, Auntie Pat, Lydia Miller's mum. So don't anyone here tell him I said this. Anyway, I'd known Lydia doing the play with her, Radiance, and I'd sat on some panels. And does anyone know Lydia? She's fierce. And particularly when she was younger, she was ferocious fierce, to the point, and highly intelligent. So I'm like proper simple one. So when she starts going, I'm like, I actually can't even understand what she's saying. She's so above me in terms of her super intelligence, but then also that aggressive thing. So I'm like leaning like this away. I'm not saying anything after you. And she was just like, and just cuts the audience down. So everyone's just shaking in their cyborgs. And I'm just like, whoa, so ferocious. And I definitely remember thinking, I don't know if this is I don't know if this is helping. Anyway, then I go to this other panel, year later, or whatever, and it's actually radio station, and that silly old white fella, Philip, what's his name? Anyway, he's that. That one. Yeah. Anyway, there's a whole lot of people on the panel, all white fellas, except for Pat O'Shane, saying, oh my God, this is like 27 years ago. Should white fellas tell black stories? Can you believe we're having those stupid conversations? Anyway, still having those stupid conversations. Anyway, and she absolutely saying the same thing as her daughter, spoke to the audience that they weren't the problem, they were part of the solution. She talked to the audience like, we know that this is blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And I was just watching her going, oh my God. So that she was able to speak to an audience's better side. So all of us deep down, that's what I keep thinking. I know there's this kind of like, it always feels like we're talking about us and them and stuff, but it's actually on a really human level. Everybody understands these really basic principles of being self-determined in your own affairs, and it's actually really, really simple. So anyway, in this one extraordinary lesson to me was seeing Pat O'Shane be just as staunch as her daughter, but speak to the audience in a way that they were invited to be a part of the solution, and it was just mind-boggling. And I've taken that into my heart and in terms of the theatre that I make as well. So I'm not interested in actually berating people and making you wrong. It's like, you might have fucked up, but hey, we're all human, and now let's all be part of the solution.
Well, on that note,
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And can you please put your hands together for Rachael Maza?
And Rhianna Patrick.
Yay! Amazing.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Go home.
And Jeremy Ambrose.